afternoon. So this is a first run through of the slides to get your input that can then be fed into the Cape Town conversations. Um, so I'll just go back to the beginning. I'm going to go through them relatively quickly. And then what I'd encourage you to do is be taking notes about points that you'd like to raise, and then maybe we can go back through each of the key sections of the presentation to hear your input. And it doesn't look like we have a lot of our colleagues from other types of evidence intermediaries on the line, but if they do end up joining, we just want to make sure that we give time to them to make sure that we're hearing from their likely complementary inputs. So this is a very exciting time. We're currently living in a world where there's bad news, it seems, in the headlines every day, but this is a bit of a bright light in that sea of largely bad news. And it's a particularly exciting time for those providing timely, demand-driven evidence synthesis and support. The folks that are involved in this call may or may not recognize themselves in this language, but how we think about it is they may be supporting advisory and decision-making processes. So that may be with people like government policymakers, with learning and improvement platforms. So I saw Chris from Magic app. We have other counterparts involved in things like the Education Endowment Foundation Teaching and Learning Toolkit, and others may be involved in helping to put evidence at the center of everyday life, citizens serving citizen-led NGOs. Our sense is that ESIC will transform how we do aspects of our work, and so we need to start preparing now. And very concretely, ESIC will provide them with what we hope will be immediately actionable insights and with data on tap that can then be rapidly contextualized to meet user needs alongside many needed forms of national and local evidence. So that's a slide you've probably seen before. This one too, a reminder of where we're going. ESIC is primarily focused on building the base of this structure, the 5 infrastructure elements, but something that emerged in the late stage of the planning process was the importance of simultaneously delivering what we've called vanguard suites of living evidence syntheses, as well as portals, so that there are immediately usable insights coming out of all of this work. So the building of the base has to happen as we're simultaneously trying to deliver insights that can be immediately acted on. We're just in the final stages, so 1 week away from an opportunity to stress test and refine the thinking that is now in the roadmap that was published in English on Friday, and we hope will be available in 6 other languages by the end of the business day today in the Eastern time zone. And we hope that Cape Town will be a launch pad for action. Some of that will be enabled by funding. Other things, people will be able to start to make adjustments in their approaches to their work quite soon. So an overview of the roadmap, it positions ESIC as serving as the end beneficiaries for types of decision makers, but evidence intermediaries are very front and center as the key immediate user group because of how they support those 4 types of decision makers. It locates equity at the heart of the infrastructure, the processes and outputs enabled by it, and its impacts on people, and it proposes a distributed infrastructure governed and delivered through a collective impact framework. If you look at the roadmap, the current budget requirement is $280 million US over 5 years. 30% of those funds have already been and you'll notice in the appendix documentation of the types of cost-reducing synergies likely to reduce the estimate. So keep in mind that each of the 6 groups went away, did their work, and then while there have been efforts over the last few weeks to zero in on potential synergies, there are likely more there than have been currently captured. We also estimate declines in the marginal costs of synthesis. You'll see using a particular estimate of what some people call the decay rate, what we estimate that being over a 5-year period of time. And there's also a proposed transition to what we call policy scale living evidence syntheses, and I'm going to come back to that. So some of you will be in Cape Town for the stress testing and refinement. You'll all have an opportunity this week to provide feedback through the open consultation process, and then there will be a number of other engagements like this one that will continue in this case after Cape Town, but for other interest holders, there will be other engagements later this week. So this is an overview of the roadmap, 5 steps and a set of underlying principles drawn from the Show Me the Evidence consensus, making then ESIC a cornerstone of the global evidence infrastructure. I think that the first, third, and fifth are the ones where evidence intermediaries are going to be particularly central, but there are a couple of ways in as well in steps 2 and 4, but I'm proposing we spend more of our time discussing 1, 3, and 5. So I won't go through the Show Me the Evidence features, but because all of you will have seen them, but those are some of the principles underpinning the roadmap. These next 2 slides, and I'm not going to read them through, I just want to draw your attention to the bolded items. These are the proposed solutions that appear in the ESIC roadmap. The ones in bold are the ones where evidence intermediaries are likely to be particularly key. Feeding in statements of user needs, both topics where syntheses are needed, but also the way in which the findings would be most helpful to be presented. There are also proposals for a regional and country-based learning and development centers with secretariats that build up from country nodes and recognize the principle of subsidiarity. So that principle means anything that can be done at the country or more local level should be done there, and only things that are uniquely able and most efficiently able to be done at the regional level should be done there. Then structures for these evidence support units to be embedded within user organizations. A number of you are already in such roles, and apologies for the C there, that should be capitalized, co-production labs that will help us to do better partnered research with citizens in particular, but also, of course, policymakers and others. Although we'll be users of the data, it's not as likely that evidence intermediaries will be as centrally involved in the sharing, the sharing of the information. I should probably bold reusing for us. Then safe and responsible tools, safe and responsible use of AI. The proposal is to develop tools that will help us in our provision of evidence support. And there will also be best practices, so guidance for how we do that, and an inventory of quality assured AI tools that will also help us decide when and how we can incorporate these AI tools in our work as evidence intermediaries. There are also solutions proposed to develop new methods guidance that help us in the types of synthesis and support work that we do, particularly with context-specific evidence synthesis. In capacity sharing, there's a proposal for an ESIC knowledge hub that will give us the tools we need, including a partner database of evidence intermediaries so we can easily find our peers to learn from them and to share our own experiences. And there's also a proposed solution for continuous professional development modules, mentorship, train-the-trainer programs for people like us. And then finally, there's a call for funding to support collaboration that builds through communities of practice. So a logical community of practice would grow out of this group of evidence intermediaries. So that's a run through of the solutions. Really important to hear your reactions to what it would mean to implement these. Some of the examples of issues that have come up, how best to sequence them in order to allow you as evidence intermediaries to most deliver value quickly in your work. And how could we think about, from a funder perspective, gated approvals of new funding as milestones are met, while balancing that against the need that many centers have for sustainable funding that keeps teams together, and with clear growth opportunities. So on the one hand, it's a lot of money. Funders are likely going to be thinking about milestones that need to be met for additional funds to flow. But at the same time, we realize centers and units need sustainable funding. The second step is make user-centered evidence synthesis the norm. So two parts here, evidence synthesis products that users really want and create and keep new users. And you'll see under the first, users really want timely, relevant, and affordable synthesis. They want evidence for big decisions, and they want co-production, particularly with citizens. The evidence for big decisions is the one where I think it would be most helpful to get your thoughts about implementation. And there are kind of two examples among many for what this could look like. So one example would be a single large-scale living evidence synthesis addressing the benefits, feasibility, and acceptability across all known interventions targeting an outcome. So we saw this during COVID-19 with the 3 living evidence syntheses about all COVID-19 treatments. There's a proposal in a new report that just came out on Friday to do the same for all preventive services for each population segment. So both of those examples come from health. In the education sector, arguably, the teaching and learning toolkit is an example of lining up all interventions that can improve teaching and learning. So that's one example. Another example would come from the UN system, multiple component syntheses, assessing. So with the first example lines everything up in one, what you could call a meta living evidence synthesis. The second one builds it up through component syntheses, what's known about different dimensions of addressing an SDG. So if you have any reactions to that, let us know. Creating and keeping new users is in part about equitable global provision. So people see people involved in their own region or sub-region doing this work, and that provides mechanisms to keep them at the table. Make sure we're addressing all societal challenges, not just looking under well-explored areas like clinical questions, and integration into users' preferred sources of information. So one thing we heard very strongly, people don't want to have to go to 7 different places. They ideally want a pipeline that connects into a tool that they are already using as part of their workflow. So when we come back to implementation, keep in mind this question of, I think evidence intermediaries have a lot to offer, thinking about what these new approaches to evidence for big decisions look like. What's needed? What do you think are promising examples that already exist? What do you think would be new approaches that should be tried? Step 3 is about working with evidence intermediaries who support decision makers. So this cuts to the heart of what all of the people on this call are involved in. So the lovely thing from our perspective is that the roadmap singles out support for evidence intermediaries as the critical step for ESIC. We will all need support to make use of the actionable insights that come in from these evidence syntheses. We need support to make use of these open reusable data that we can quickly contextualize, and we need to be able to contribute to and rely on quality assurance work to make sure that our own reputations and so on are enhanced, not damaged, by leveraging these global assets. In return, these evidence intermediaries, I think, will be asked to organize themselves regionally according to the roadmap to contribute to their understanding of user needs. What topics are of interest, what decision-making processes and windows of opportunity need to be aligned to, what's the policy context in which the insights will be used, what's the political context where evidence may be useful. The roadmap lays out a number of different types of evidence intermediaries. The folks on this call are more often in those 2 groups at the top left, and there's a brief statement in italics under each one of what ESIC will mean for them. And again, really great to hear your thoughts about, does this capture it, and how would we go about implementing it? The other groups are science advisors. There are other ways in for ESIC through networks like INGSA, the International Network for Government Science Advice. There will be a number of citizen-led, citizen-serving NGOs at INGSA that attempt to put evidence at the center of everyday life. They will be key users of this. Then there are the multilateral bodies. So far, the engagement has been primarily with evaluation units across 53 UN entities, but more recently through the multilateral development banks with their work on country sector level diagnostics and project appraisals that inform their massive investments. Researchers, what's key here is feedback loops that help them identify gaps in priority areas, and the design and methodological characteristics need to add value in responses. And then there are all the other groups working with applied forms of evidence, and evidence synthesis can be powerful inputs to their work. And there's the beginning of a list of the ways that evidence synthesis can play into the workflows of those other groups. So a question for you here, as well as any other implementation considerations you can think of, how can we collectively support learning and improvement within and across these types of evidence intermediaries? So to go back to this slide, how do we learn among ourselves, the people more in the top left corner, but also how do we learn from and bring our insights to these many other groups that are listed on this page or that slide? Step 4, almost done. More people start using and keep using high quality evidence synthesis. So decision ready information for decisions that matter. You'll see the 4 categories of decision makers, but on this slide, you'll also see funders, of which 4 types have been engaged through the ESIC planning process. And they may be involved in supporting the operationalization of these decisions because they are bringing funds to the table that allow all of this to happen. So here, an implementation question for you. How can we better articulate what ESIC will mean for each of these types of decision maker, and then refine a monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan to capture progress and course correct as needed? So if as evidence intermediaries, we're not seeing the changes on the ground among these types of decision makers based on our work, how do we identify that? And then how do we make the necessary course corrections? The final step, better informed decisions, improve people's lives and save money. If you've looked at this part of the roadmap, you'll see this is an incredibly ambitious timeline. The bullets that are most relevant to us as intermediaries in year 1, actionable insights on 100 of the biggest societal challenges of our time. By year 2, actionable insights on hundreds of challenges. In year 1, early adopting evidence intermediaries can now easily put the many needed forms of local evidence alongside what we've learned from around the world and how these learnings vary by groups and contexts. So that's where ESIC comes in. And by year 2, a growing proportion of intermediaries have the capacity and access needed to draw on ESIC in providing high quality, timely, and demand-driven evidence support. And the aspiration by year 5, a fully transformed evidence ecosystem able to pivot, sorry, that should say quickly, I could have sworn I'd made that change, to emerging priorities. So the big question for all of us here, are we prepared to move this fast, delivering impacts early and often to make the case for escalating investment? So again, this is a really ambitious timeline. What do you think about that? The final slide, ways to stay engaged. So you can provide feedback on the roadmap before the consultation window closes on Friday. There will be daily written recaps that go out at around 6 or 7 p.m. South Africa time each day of the consensus meeting. There will also be a daily webinar led by our colleague Laura Boera at roughly the same time each day. In Cape Town, the big focus is going to be each day addressing 3 questions. If the roadmap was implemented, what are the recommendations that would benefit the most context sectors and interest holder groups? And what are the potential risks or concerns? And how might we approach implementation in a way that prevents or responds to them? And that's the point that I'm really hoping to hear from all of you today. I've laid out some of those risks or concerns and thoughts about how we need to approach implementation, but we need to hear from all of you. Third thing, watch for a revised version of the roadmap and other derivative products to be published after Cape Town, hopefully within a few weeks, and begin engaging your organization and possibly your peer organization in discussions about how to leverage ESIC in future and how to participate in ongoing conversations to shape it. So that's a quick run through. It's a very big document. I think it's 37 pages. And the purpose of today was to catch you up on what we think are the most important points for evidence intermediaries, and to engage you in a conversation about what do you think we need to be most attentive to as we start to think about operationalizing or implementing this roadmap. Carrie, would you add anything else before we kick it off? Okay. So can I turn it over to you to facilitate the
Sure. So a lot of questions being posed. So happy to hear some thoughts either on any of the questions that John asked regarding implementation, risks, or feedback on the roadmap more generally. So just we'll use the little hand if you're looking for it. It's under reactions, and look for someone to kick us off.
Did I stun everybody into silence?
Fernando, go ahead.
Hi, Fernando from IPA Peru. One challenge for the implementation I could think of is when, well, I guess maybe you have thought about this already, but when you have to address transnational complex policy issues like climate change or migration, I don't know if you have thought of mechanisms of providing evidence services when you need like multiple governments involved. You already have problems when you have different sectors involved. When, for instance, in Peru, when you have to address violence against women, we work with the Ministry of Women, but also you need the judiciary to be involved. But we don't have access to that, and it's a more difficult actor to reach. So our evidence advisories work suffers from that. We have limited action, and the Ministry of Women has limited action for that as well. So I don't know if you have thought of mechanisms for this.
Fantastic, Fernando. So my quick answer is it's come up in conversation, but you're quite right to point out that it's absent from these slides. And I think it's also under developed in the roadmap. I think there may be a call out to multilateral processes where governments come together to, come to joint agreements around climate or conservation or other things. So we need to lift that up. So I will add that to this slide deck, and then the multi-sectoral one as well, and thinking about different branches within the executive arm of government, but the judiciary as well. Again, it come up in the remote recesses of our minds, but not foregrounded. So we'll need to capture that as well. Excellent. This is exactly the type of feedback that we need from folks. So thank you, Fernando.
Great. Over to Chris.
Thank you. That was a really helpful presentation, John. I'd read the report, but actually seeing those slides was really helpful to really get my head into some of the detail. One thing that I particularly wanted to pick up on is in the step 5 slide, there was something, I can't remember what the timescales were, but that sort of midterm timescale, there was something there around intermediaries have the skills and capacity to do the job they need to do to make evidence sort of impactful, and it's that growing proportion have capacity and access needed, etc. I really like that, but I don't feel it's necessarily supported through the building blocks leading up to that. And actually, I've been jotting notes throughout thinking, oh, we need a bit more around building the capacity for people to, in my case, anyone who doesn't know me, I'm in the health guidelines space. My bias is there towards health and guidelines, but I think it's really critical that local contextualization, building the guidelines and doing that work so that the evidence synthesis has an impact in practice. And I'd say it comes out there at the end, but I didn't feel it was quite coming through in the earlier bits.
Excellent.
Yeah, and particularly that point around context you mentioned in what you're saying about contextualization.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't quite see that in the detail as much, but
Absolutely.
the overarching and evidence synthesis can at a global level is really important, but often on a local level, it needs a lot of contextualization to make it relevant.
Yeah, excellent point. And your point also makes me think, Chris, that we need to sometimes put examples in brackets because contextualization for you may mean a locally adapted guideline and it may be something different for others. So let's get the examples in so people see themselves, including people from your community focused on guideline development and implementation.
Exactly.
Excellent.
Over to Steph.
Thanks, Gary. My question is, like, evidence intermediaries are a broad group, right? So there are different types of evidence intermediaries. So, my point is that how to engage these evidence intermediaries with ESIC, and what would be their role, like from their part, what the evidence intermediaries can do, both the evidence intermediaries from the government side, like who are directly engaged with government and who are not actually part of government, but somehow supporting the government with evidence. And what would be ESIC's role to connect with these evidence intermediaries, or what would be your take on this? Like, what will you offer to them?
Yeah, so a big question, Seth, because so many of the solutions that were in those two slides. I know it was a really complex table, but that's a summary of what ESIC is proposing to provide to intermediaries to enable this work. So let me just go back and run through some of the most important points. But all of this is an effort to describe what's needed, and we need to hear from evidence intermediaries about whether this will help. So it would provide a vehicle to elevate their expressions of user needs, the topics, the formats, and so on, to the regional and global level so people can act on it. There would be support for these regional centers that build up from country nodes. There would be direct support to actual units in countries where they don't yet exist and need to start to be scaled up. Lower down, there would be support to the intermediaries with these tools that we can use in our work. There would be guidelines available to us. There would be an inventory of AI tools that we could draw on to decide what we can incorporate when. There would be new methods guidance to us for how we do our contextualization work. There would be innovation grants for folks who want to pilot a new approach to how we do our work. So those are some of the examples of what's on offer. So ESIC cannot support, of course, the totality of the evidence intermediary actions out there, but it can serve as a key funder that is very strategic about how it most helps evidence intermediaries. So hopefully that begins to get at it. And again, I know it's I sometimes use the expression, it's drinking from a fire hose. It's a lot to take in, but those are the solutions on offer. But we need to hear from actual evidence intermediaries like you and others on the call. Will this deliver what you need in order to have this step change improvement that we're hoping for?
Great. There's just, Steph, does that answer the question? Or did you want to ask a follow-up? You're okay?
No, I just had a follow-up question to this. More specifically, for example, if it is a part of government, the evidence intermediary is part of government or evidence support group of the government. So what would be their role at this moment? Like how could they get involved directly?
Yeah, it's a good point. We have a road test of that in a few hours. Carrie and I are dealing with a particular government who want to know what this means to them. So it's tricky. I mean, some of what I described will be usable by them, but of course, ESIC can't be in the business of supporting governments on core functions. But ESIC can make available tools they can use. ESIC can make available data. And yes, to your point, Chris, that was a mistake. I need to correct that data sharing and reusing slide because intermediaries will be very important reusers. So I think some of what we're talking about will be directly usable to and in support of folks who are embedded in government. But we just have to watch that, you know, it's not the case that the funding can necessarily flow directly to them, but the tools and communities of practice and other things can benefit them. Does that make sense? Carrie, do you want to
Thanks.
come in?
Perfect.
Yeah, I was gonna, before I hand it to Peter, I was gonna use my facilitation powers of asking John my own question, which is, do you think after this process is done in Cape Town, is there an effort? I know there's an effort to kind of digitize some of the roadmap and potentially make it a little bit more interactive. Are there also efforts to try and speak a little bit more to what Seth is getting at with, if I am an evidence intermediary in a government, what's available to me? Like, are there kind of roadmap light version for each of the different groups, or has that been talked about at all?
Well, I think what's been talked about so far, and again, you know, everything's open for discussion, is for Cape Town to have a one-pager for each category of interest holder to summarize in one place what we think ESIC will mean for a group. So that would mean there would be a one-pager for government policymakers as a category of interest holder. But I love your idea of, you know, light versions of products. There may need to be something specific to that group or to the evidence intermediaries document that land the plane more concretely for folks in the intersection between those embedded evidence intermediaries in government. What does it mean for you? So, you know, this is meant to be a collective enterprise, you know, supported by a collective impact framework. But if people want to take on the job of crafting a version of a product that uniquely meets those needs, drawing from other products that exist now with the roadmap or will exist within a week for Cape Town, then my sense would be more power to you. That's exactly the type of on-the-ground leadership that it would be lovely to see.
Great. Over to Peter.
Thanks, Kerry. I've got a couple of observations. A few of them are from just for, you know, just to make it clear, I've been in one of the working groups on demand side. So just a couple of insights around implementation from that. One is that the capability maturity assessments, which are the tables at the end of the roadmap, are global and were done at speed. And I think that they should be regionalised as an implementation step. Now we've got the RESAs, we've got you know, that could be as simple as regionalising them based on just our surface level knowledge, or it could be as detailed as a global RESA for every country. But I think there is a need to do that as an implementation first step. The second one is behavioural, and I think that the incentive models, having seen lots of standards and guidelines come and go, everyone who's involved in guidelines would know that the incentive models for adhering to them are the critical step. And there are one of the things I learned from the Working Group 1 meeting is the politicisation of questions and the potential for global data to be misused. And I think that is a considerable risk, but it does come back to why would people adhere to whatever standards we might, you know, what incentives do they have? I'll just toggle through two more. I know I'm covering a couple of bases in one go. As you know, John and Kerry, I'm very obsessed with how we decide the big questions and what the criteria are. So I'll just put that on the table again because that's what I like to bang. And the fourth one, I don't know if you can show the slide with the circles on it that was towards the end. But I think that the role of content matter experts and researchers, I see evidence intermediaries as a convener of content matter expertise. And so certainly I often, I guess, subcontract people within the university to provide interpretation, particularly at the front and back end of reviews. And I don't know how researchers are a separate dot, but I also don't know how to represent them as part of the process. Part of the convening function of evidence intermediaries is to actually marshal content matter expertise. I can send these to you in written form, but that's my 4 very quick observations and questions.
No, really helpful. And keep in mind, everybody, the Peter's second point, all of them are important. His second point made me think about how one of the planning groups that we aspired to set up but didn't end up having the time and resources to set up was focused on change management. And so for those who are going to Cape Town on day one, day one, there are 2 concurrent sessions on change management. And so this whole notion of the incentives that are out there now, how we shift those incentives and so on, is going to be the focus of those 2 sessions. So I would encourage you, if you're going to Cape Town, and you're passionate about that, then get to one of those sessions. If you're not going to Cape Town and you have thoughts about change management, please send them in, because it is currently a really underdeveloped part of the thinking here. And yet, at the end of the day, it's absolutely critical that that be undertaken methodically going forward. So thanks, Peter, for all 4. I've got them all noted. Other comments? Sherry, I see you online with your experience in the humanitarian space. If you want to come in with any thoughts about implementation in the unique contexts in which the International Rescue Committee works, or anybody else on the line, we'd love to get your thoughts into play here, so we're all thinking about this actively in the coming weeks.
Yeah, thanks so much, John, for the overview. I think that much of what you've shared does resonate. A couple of points came up when we looked at step 4, I believe, around the key decision makers. I see that you have called out particular types of decision makers sitting in different organizations or with different functions. And the thought that occurred to me immediately is that actually there's quite a bit of, not overlap, but strong relationships, for example, between donors and key decision makers within an NGO, for example, right? And there's already, at least with IRC, a strong move towards identifying shared interests around research agenda development, around evidence syntheses, and so on. And so I thought, while it is correct that these are different decision-making groups and for whom, evidence intermediaries are very charged and important, I think there could be a way for us to think about the relationships across these groups, right? And in thinking through what the learning or monitoring and evaluation plan would look like for assessing whether ESIC and evidence intermediaries and the tools that are being provided are actually in service of decision-making, aligning with evidence that's emerging. I think making space for identifying those shared nodes, and they don't just reside in the sort of multilateral relationships, right? And the convening spaces like within the UN and the clusters and so on. It's not just there. I think more and more we're going to see these sort of, centers for X, Y, and Z. Welcome Trust has funded many of those, and I think other donors are looking in that direction as well.
Amazing. Super. Really helpful. I imagine exactly where we can start to feed that into the slides with implementation considerations. Excellent, Sherry. Other reactions, and it would be good to, and I'm sorry for calling on individuals, but I see Shelley-Ann, for example, who, has been so centrally involved in the whole process. Shelley-Ann, did that land from a big picture perspective, and do you have any thoughts from your own context in Trinidad and Tobago and working across the Caribbean about other implementation considerations that need to be front and center? The point about sustainability, that was there in part thinking about your environment, about how while funders may want gated approvals, centers like yours need to know that they have funding for many years into the future so that you can really invest in people and show them career pathways and become that reliable resource that everybody knows will be there to turn to.
Thanks so much, John, for even mentioning that. So One of the questions I think I had, or one of my concerns is that, it came up again in working group one discussion, is that all evidence intermediaries are not at the same level.
Mm-hmm.
And some of us struggling to get, again, the attention of our governments and other end users, as well as struggling to really emphasize the importance of the use of evidence still. We recently visited the Ministry of Health in Guyana, and we were able to train the heads of all of their programmatic areas, an introductory workshop in terms of evidence-informed decision-making and the role of evidence in decision-making. And this goes to show again that we are at the bottom level, still pushing sensitization and awareness, pushing fundamental steps and processes, as opposed to really being able to tap into living evidence synthesis. When I brought up living evidence synthesis in the training, nobody knew what that is, had no ideas. We're still not even really tapping into systematic reviews. Just to know that all evidence intermediaries are not at the starting line. Some of us are way behind the starting line. And we really want to know how ESIC is going to understand, know that how we're going to be prioritized, and how support would be given for us in the starting line of it. Thanks, Sean.
Excellent. Super. Thank you very much, Leanne. Really important. And that's an example of another implementation consideration we need to add explicitly. How do we support different groups based on where they currently are and where the context in which they currently are is? Other reactions to implementation considerations?
John, if I might, thanks, Charlene, for your point. It also prompted a consideration on the humanitarian side. So we are evidence intermediaries within a humanitarian organization that increasingly works with partners, local partners, right? And so I think not only am I thinking about the great inclusion of continuous capacity sharing and development within and among evidence intermediaries, but I think there is also, at least from our perspective as humanitarian actors, there will be a need for translation of that to partners, many of whom actually is outlining non-government actors, but many partners who are we're open to using evidence, but may have less exposure to date, and who I think come with many different perspectives that can really enrich the process. So I think that there is a line that can be tied somehow between this focus on being very people-centered, right? Like thinking about how are we driving these questions and concerns from the ground up, tying that into also the capacity sharing, making a link to the capacity sharing and building that will happen on the evidence intermediaries part. Again, I mean, the very real example from the humanitarian side is that, we will work with partners and they are fully decision makers in and of themselves, right? And so how do we, with an evidence use mandate, also support and encourage and drive that evidence use in countries where the governments might be doing this or not? And local partners might not have had as much exposure as we to this point.
Excellent. Fantastic.
Fernando has his hand up, so.
Hi. Yeah, I just want, this is more like an open question that I'm doing it to myself as well in my work. And maybe it will come up also in the implementation of this, is to what extent government themselves should be trained, or well, they should be trained, but should they do it themselves, this evidence-based work, or to what extent they should rely on evidence intermediaries? So yeah, I mean, this comes from the question of our work with embedded evidence labs, where we motivate the governments themselves to do the work of translating evidence, having embedded units. I mean, this is more like an open questions on to what extent we get there, right?
Absolutely. Really important point. And this is one of many reasons why I would so love to live in a world that I hope will co-create in the coming years, where we're learning across each other about our different experiences on questions exactly like that, Fernando. So we've had very little interaction with the embedded evidence labs, and reciprocally, I think they may have had relatively little interaction with some of the other people on this call coming at it from different perspectives. And yet, so much of what we're doing is similar, and the insights that we can draw from our different contexts and sectors and so on will be so important in understanding, you know, where does it make sense that these skills just be, you know, a key part of what governments do? Where do they need embedded evidence labs? And where is there a role for people outside government working in evidence intermediary units? And do we need all three of them? Does it vary depending on where the country is? Does it depend on a variety of other factors? So I think that's a really great question that it would be great to noodle through together. What have been our different experiences with that? And what do we think we should be driving for? All three of them, or a bit more emphasis on one of the three, or something different? So that's another example of something that I can note down as an implementation consideration. Again, this notion of how do we surface and share experiences with those types of questions. Any other reactions before we wrap up for today? Have anything else by way of next steps?
The only other piece was what came up in our previous meeting. If folks who are going to Cape Town, if there's an interest in kind of self-organizing a little bit to try to meet and make sure that we're kind of landing the plane and dividing and conquering during the sessions wherever possible. So it'd be good just to hear from folks if they think that would be a useful exercise or not.
Great. So maybe you can keep doing what Shelly-Ann has done. Just put it, if you're going to Cape Town, and would be interested in meeting, maybe alert Carrie. And if you don't get to it in the chat box or it's not activated for you, it would be good if you could email her. I see about half of the people on the line will be in Cape Town. So if you're willing to meet, I know that our citizen leader partners are mobilizing each day. They're going to be meeting to kind of gear up for the day and debrief about the preceding day. So I think the more that evidence intermediaries can be self-organizing and think about what messages do you want to share collectively, and know that if you're speaking up in a concurrent session, for example, that you can say, look, I've consulted with the 19 other evidence intermediaries here, and one of the things that we all feel passionately about is X. That will, I think, be a really important signal to people that they need to sit up and take notice of the message. So of course you're welcome to speak as individuals with all of the power that comes from your individual experiences, but when you're willing to convey a widely shared view from your peers, I think it's even more helpful. And Peter, yes, absolutely. If somebody wants to, set up a WhatsApp channel, the citizens I know are doing that already. Have a shared document where you're capturing notes. So Peter, if you're willing to organize that, that would be great. Any other thoughts? And again, for those, it's such a shame, of course, that we can't get everybody who's passionate about this topic to the meeting, and the Cape Town invitation list was partly based on the very difficult selection of the group members who've been involved for the last 6 months. And we had, I think, 4 times as many applicants for membership as we could take. And then we're trying to fill gaps in key interest holder categories. So it was a very difficult meeting to get as many people there as we were hoping to, but there are still those ways to keep abreast of what's happening next week. And you have the open consultation open until Friday, but then our hope is that you'll be interested in picking up this conversation after Cape Town and working through how we better work with one another as a community of evidence intermediaries. So we'll leave it there. Carrie, do you want to just wrap up?
Yeah, so thanks everyone for your time today. We'll get some notes out as well as the recordings with the different timestamps, and look out for a call for a WhatsApp group from Peter and I, as well as some times to meet during Cape Town. So thanks so much, and safe flights for everyone who's going.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.